Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
But she couldn't fool herself. Often Emma caught herself looking at his strong arms, his broad shoulders, or the aristocratic features of his face turned toward her in profile when he wasn't looking. As soon as she noticed it, she looked away. Sometimes it seemed to her that Edward knew exactly what was going on at such moments. More than that he liked it and that he was just as discreetly scrutinizing her as he thought no one was looking at him, but neither of them dared to make the next move. Perhaps it was simply too soon for that. The lawyer didn't show up until a month later. He was as bright as a Christmas tree and seemed eager to share his findings. However, when Emma opened the door for him, the first thing he asked was whether Edward was home. Not yet, but he should be within a couple of hours. Well then, if you don't mind, I'd prefer to wait for him. It's a long story that involves both of you, so I don't want to tell it twice. Right now, I can only tell you that the case is closed and all charges against you have been dropped. Really? Emma exclaimed happily. That's right, confirmed the satisfied lawyer. When Edward returned home, he found the two men in the kitchen. They were sitting at the table and drinking tea peacefully, chatting about some nonsense. When they saw him, however, they both jumped up and practically demanded that he change his clothes and join their company. Emma was panting with curiosity, and the lawyer with the desire to tell everything as soon as possible. Finally, when the landlord sat down at the kitchen table and was handed a mug of hot tea, the lawyer took a big sip from his mug and began his story. The longer he spoke, the more implausible the story seemed to everyone present. Nevertheless, every word he said was pure truth. And to begin with, perhaps, it is necessary to start with the fact that your key, Emma, perfectly matched the lock on the door. In fact, when the experts examined it, they had no doubts about it. They opened the door with all possible precautions. Nobody knew what might be inside. And when they opened it, at first they couldn't believe their eyes. The room was completely empty. Only a careful search in some dusty corner found a box, and in it documents. That's when the police had a new prime suspect. You'll never guess who. The headmaster of the village school? Unexpectedly, even to herself, Emma asked, "Exactly." The lawyer stared at her in amazement. "How did you guess?" Clara didn't like him. She suspected that he had thrown her out of her job on the pretext of her age in order to put his young mistress in her place. And she was quite right, chuckled the lawyer. I would even say that she didn't suspect it, but knew about it. The documents found in the box prove it, as well as the fact that the principal was dirty. He took money from students and parents for A's in exams and from teachers to cover up some of their sins. But listen to this, the police started digging into this principal. He didn't personally, after all, crawl under the house with a can of gasoline. Besides, it's unlikely he could have slipped her sleeping pills. She wouldn't have let him in. So he had at least one accomplice. A mistress? Edward asked, and her too. The lawyer nodded. Her role was to slip him sleeping pills. She came to Clara as if just to talk to her, and at first she didn't want to let her in, but then decided that nothing bad would come of it. She poured her some tea and decided to have a drink herself. And that's when, as you can imagine, the first act of this tragedy took place. The girl told the police during the interrogation and immediately gave up her lover when she felt that she was facing a very serious sentence for complicity. She swears, by the way, that she knew nothing about the arson. She thought the director's accomplices would just sneak into the house, find and take the documents, and that would be it. Honestly, I believe her. Well, she doesn't even look like an accomplice to something that serious. However, it's up to the court to decide how guilty she is, but more on that later. It turns out that this director has a second job. He is the head of some criminal group and sent some of his friends to the case, claims that the arson was not planned, and they really only had to take the documents. And these fools couldn't open the lock, so they decided to just burn the whole basement down. Well, this one's lying. Emma was convinced. Yes, he is. The lawyer objected. The police dug up so much on him that it doesn't matter whether it's more arson or less arson. In any case, he'll get a decent sentence. He's got a whole bunch of crimes on him. You can't imagine how many cases were closed at once, but the most interesting thing. He stopped and looked at Emma strangely, then continued. However, under the circumstances, it's probably not the best choice of words. I apologize. Anyway, his men are to blame for your husband's death. Emma shrieked in surprise, then covered her mouth with her palm. After a few seconds, she regained the power of speech, but the police said that they were acting as some unskilled criminals who didn't intend to harm him, but were just frightened, that's why. Yeah, they went to a lot of trouble to make the police think that, but it was the opposite. It was just a cover-up. But why? Emma asked. Edward had always been an honest businessman, never getting involved in any dubious ventures. What could he have done to cross them? The lawyer sighed. He had crossed them, but not them. They were only the executors, not the customers. Well, that's the unpleasant part. Apparently, there were at least 6 people involved. Emma remained silent and stared at the lawyer in horror. She guessed what he would say in the next moment. They were his parents, his brother, 2 sisters, and his maternal uncle. Perhaps some other relatives, but that could not be ascertained for sure. Motive, however. Emma sighed. She understood exactly what the motive might have been. Her. They all hated not only the homeless orphan, but also their own son, brother, nephew, who had brought her into their family, and in this terrible way had decided to take revenge on him and her at the same time. There was, besides personal animosity, also an inheritance. Finished the lawyer. Inheritance? Emma didn't understand, but there was a small amount of money, which, some of it went to me, but nothing else. The house belonged to his parents. If they wanted it so badly, they could just kick us all out without resorting to such measures, couldn't they? Not at all, objected the lawyer. The house belonged entirely to him, and the will should have left it to you. The documents you were shown were not real. There was a long silence in the room, and the lawyer was the first to break it. Digging into his briefcase, he pulled out some documents and handed them to Emma. This is yours. It confirms ownership of the house. You may return there at any time or otherwise dispose of it as you see fit. If you'll excuse me, my wife's waiting for me at home. In principle, everything I wanted to tell you. If you have any questions or need my services again, call me. He dressed and left the apartment, and Emma and Edward sat silently at the table for a long time, digesting what they had heard. Finally, without saying a word, the man placed his palm on hers. She turned her head and smiled warmly at him. Who would have thought they would take the next step towards each other under such strange circumstances? Emma wanted nothing to do with either her late husband's house or the one she had inherited from her grandmother. She sold both and used the proceeds to buy a spacious apartment in the city, which she intended to rent out. The remaining money went to various bank deposits, providing a stable future for the woman and her children. In the 11th grade, Mary went to her old school and graduated with a gold medal. Apparently, the events that took place had a strong impact on her choice of life path. The girl resolutely told her mother that she was going to go to law school to then go to work in the police. Emma, however, was not going to oppose her. James was sent to the same math boarding school, which looked for him Clara. But now that they lived in the city, he could go there as if he were going to a normal school after school, and when he returned home, the rules did not forbid it. On the contrary, the administration was only too happy not to have to find a place for him in the dormitory. Emma and Edward married the year Mary successfully entered the law faculty of one of the capital's universities. They were very worried about how the girl would take the news, but to everyone's surprise, she did not object and was not even surprised to receive an invitation to the wedding. Mary spends all her vacations in the house of her mother and her new husband, and they are waiting for another, now a common child. Why do I have to clean up after him? Mary asked in a deliberately squeaky voice, her lips puckered. You don't have to, honey. I just asked you to help because I can't do it myself. You shouldn't have had so many kids if you couldn't handle it, Mary muttered. Emma ignored the jab. What was a teenage girl to do, especially if she had to help raise her younger siblings instead of the usual teenage chores, which she did quite well, despite her objections? You can understand her. Fiddling with kids is not something you want to do at 15. Unlike many people, especially those with many children, Emma did not think that such help was the sacred duty of the eldest child, especially if he happened to be born a girl. Therefore, she was very grateful to her daughter. If it had been her will, she would never have put such a burden on Mary, but she had no special options. She really couldn't handle it all on her own. All of her children, Emma had given birth to quite deliberately. A large family had been her dream since she herself had been a child. The woman carried this desire through her life, and in the end it came true. She had everything she could dream of, 5 beautiful children, and a loving husband, an endless number of relatives ready to help and support her. Mary was considerably older than her siblings. After a difficult labor and caring for a weak, sickly child, Emma could not decide for a long time even to have a second one. However, when the eldest daughter turned 9, James was still born. 2 years later, Kayla was born, and after 3 more twins, Cindy and Ethan. So they lived a large, close-knit family that included Emma's husband, Edward, and his parents. Their home was large, spacious, and bright, and in addition, there was always someone from their spouse's numerous relatives. Aunts and uncles, brothers, sisters, relatives, cousins, second cousins, third cousins. In short, there was someone to help with the children and household chores. It was all very recent, a year ago, but Emma sometimes felt that these memories belonged to some very old times, or maybe they were not memories at all, but dreams and dreams. In their present situation, it all seemed utterly unreal. Trouble came, as often happens, quite unexpectedly. Exactly a year ago, she was at home alone. Except for the children, her husband was away on business. His numerous relatives were also busy with something. Her parents, who usually lived with them, had gone to the dacha when the first warm days came. They always left for the whole summer, though, and the rest of the family was soon to join them. They stayed in town only because Edward still had some business to attend to. Yes, Mary needed to pass her midterm exams to be accepted into 10th grade the following year. James, 5, was in his room playing with his 3-year-old sister, happily showing his sister his collection of cars. Only occasionally did Emma stop by to check on the kids. Her room was just behind the wall, so if anything happened, she would be able to react quickly to the danger. Mary had gone out with her friends, so the only thing Emma had to worry about was the newborn twins. Fortunately, unlike her eldest daughter, they were in excellent health and were, as they called it, gift children. They almost never screamed and were quite capable of occupying themselves with a variety of rattles. Also, on some nonverbal level, they could communicate with each other and were quite content in each other's company. In short, the day passed, as it always did, cheerfully and quietly. It seemed that it would always be like that. That time had frozen, that now there would be an endless June day outside the window, warm but not too warm, cozy and sunny. Emma felt absolutely happy. It was then that she realized that she had finally achieved the realization of her most important dream, and now she was truly happy. Toward evening, Mary returned and began to tell her mother how wonderful her day had been and what interesting things had happened on the walk. Emma listened to her daughter half-heartedly as she was concentrating on feeding the babies. Giving a bottle of formula to both of them at once was not as easy as she had thought, and feeding them one at a time, they couldn't stand it and started crying together. As a result, neither of them could eat. Mary, however, did not need an attentive listener. She was overwhelmed by the impressions that came out. The main thing for her was to tell about them as soon as possible, before the emotions tore the girl from the inside, and whether her words reached someone's ears was not so important. After feeding the younger children and making sure they were sleeping sweetly in their beds, Emma took care of the older ones. Setting the table in the living room, she brought in an afternoon snack. James and Mary, of course, were already able to eat on their own, but little Kayla had not quite gotten the hang of the spoon yet, so from time to time Emma came to help her. She didn't eat, she didn't want to, and she was used to eating in the company of her husband, who would be back soon. When the children had eaten, she began to prepare dinner for the two of them. No guests were expected that evening. Nevertheless, the process still dragged on for a couple of hours. Emma, having caught the culinary inspiration, could not stop and started to prepare not only the hot dish, but also the dessert. It was only after putting the cake in the freezer and checking once again that the kids were okay that she glanced at the clock and realized how much time had passed. Her husband should have been back about half an hour ago, but he was still gone. Emma wasn't particularly worried about it. There was no telling what might have caused the delay. Surely he was about to show up, otherwise he would have called to warn her that he had a change of plans. But another half hour passed, then an hour, 2, 3, and he was still gone. That's when Emma began to worry. And Mary, who knew her father's habits, sensed something wrong. The two of them began to call Edward, but to no avail. Time after time, the mechanical voice reported that the subscriber's phone was switched off or was out of range. After the 10th call, his further recommendation to call back later seemed absolutely mocking to the woman. Having failed to wait for her husband and father, everyone went to bed, all except Emma, who was to be on night duty at the baby's crib, and in any case, she would hardly be able to sleep. Sitting beside the cradle, the woman listened every minute for the key in the lock or the creak of the door, but all was silent. Edward did not appear during the night or in the morning. It was then that she first asked Mary to watch the younger children, and she went to the nearest police station to file a missing persons report. She couldn't imagine what else there was to do in such a situation. The officer on duty didn't take her problem too seriously. He was extremely reluctant, but still accepted the report from her. However, he remarked, "Your husband is an adult. Perhaps he has some reasons of his own for not showing up at home. Then he would have definitely given notice. He always calls or writes if he's going to be more than an hour late." Emma objected, "And he always keeps his phone charged and never turns it off. Things happen. Maybe he went out with an old friend and forgot about everything, or even worse. Not for him, of course, but for you." "How dare you?" Emma exclaimed indignantly. "Look, I understand you perfectly well, but alas, such cases happen all over the place. You can't imagine how many people come to us to complain about missing wives and husbands. As a rule, they are quite decent people, and in the end, after a week or two, our employees find this decent man in bed with his mistress. My husband is not like that." Emma objected rather sluggishly, more out of inertia. It was clear that she couldn't prove anything to the policeman, and why should she? He had taken a statement, so they would have to deal with the case anyway. Nothing else from the police was required now, so the woman went home after all. Her children were waiting for her. On her way back, Emma secretly hoped that her husband would be home by now. Maybe he really had met some old buddy and was now sitting by the twins' cradle, repenting for making the family worry. The house, however, was as empty as Emma had left it, and to her surprise, not only Edward, but none of his relatives were to be found there. It had never happened before that no one had visited them for 2 whole days. A bored Mary sat by the twins' crib, and Kayla and James were nestled on the mat right at her feet. They were no longer playing, but sitting quietly, snuggled up against each other and their older sister. Both of them looked a little dejected. When James heard the sound of Mom's footsteps, he looked up hopefully and then lowered his head, obviously realizing that Emma had returned alone. "When is Daddy coming back?" Kayla asked bodily. "I don't know, sweetie. I hope it's soon." Only Emma had a thought that should have crossed her mind last night, but hadn't. Apparently, due to too much anxiety gripping the woman, she should have called her husband's parents, his sister, his brother. Maybe they know something? And if they didn't, at least they should be informed of what had happened. As soon as Emma thought of that, she immediately grabbed the phone. Over the next few hours, she called seemingly everyone. Her husband's relatives, his friends, acquaintances, even business associates. No one knew anything, but everyone expressed extreme concern about what had happened. That evening, Edward did not come home again. The next few months were what took Emma from her cherished dream to her worst nightmare. Edward never showed up. His relatives suddenly stopped visiting the family as well, and what's more, they didn't even call. Apparently, they did not care about the woman and her children. The children, in turn, from nice obedient kids, began to turn into uncontrollable monsters. That is, the twins, of course, remained the same, and Mary, though noticeably dejected, but somehow kept herself in control. Only occasionally the girl let her emotions take over reason and snapped, then at her mother, then at her brother and sister. But James and Kayla were as if mad. They didn't listen and broke and smashed everything they saw in front of them. Worse, they even started fighting with each other. More precisely, the older brother constantly bullied his little sister, and she, in turn, was unable to fight back. But she was perfectly able to set up some meanness in secret. Emma understood perfectly well why it was happening, of course. The children had a real shock and had no idea how to deal with it. After all, in addition to the fact that their father had disappeared, all the other relatives had disappeared somewhere. They were used to the fact that the house was noisy, crowded, and cheerful. Besides, the little ones perfectly read the mood of their mother and older sister. But only this understanding did not give Emma an answer to the main question: what to do with all this? In addition to everything else, financial problems began to arise, of which the woman had no idea until then. However, the money in the special family account, to which only she and Edward had access, was gradually beginning to melt away, and there was nowhere for new money to come from. The missing husband didn't work, and therefore didn't get a paycheck. Emma, burdened with children and having neither education nor experience, could not even imagine from which side she should take the question of finding a job. And the expenses, by the way, were enormous, no matter how hard she tried to save money. One evening there was a knock on the door of the house. Emma opened it and found a scowling policeman on the doorstep. After introducing himself in full uniform, he asked permission to enter. Without waiting for an answer, he pushed his way into the hallway and asked, "You're Wilson Emma, right?" "Yeah." Confused, the woman confirmed. "So Wilson Edward, registered at this address and missing 3 months ago, is your husband?" "Yes." Again, Emma answered briefly. "We found him," said the policeman. She shrieked with joy, but immediately faltered as she looked at the grim face of the policeman. Slowly, very slowly, as if breaking through an invisible barrier, the meaning of his words came to her. "No," she whispered. "It can't be. Don't tell me what." "I'm sorry, but your husband is probably no longer alive. Of course, we can't be sure it's him. Not until we've conducted an identification procedure. Will you be able to attend, or should we contact his other close relatives?" Emma wanted to say something, but she felt dizzy and the ground seemed to slip away from under her feet. She swayed and grabbed the door jamb with her hand, but it did nothing to help her. After a few seconds, the woman fainted. She still forced herself to come to the lineup, realizing that if she didn't see the body, she wouldn't be able to believe and accept the inevitable. Only after a brief glance at the face, she immediately realized that there was no mistake. Before her, on the cold morgue table, lay her husband, no doubt dead. After the identification, the policeman told her at length what they thought had happened. For some reason, mentioning details that Emma would have preferred to know nothing about. It appeared that her husband had been victimized by some inept hooligans. They had robbed him of his wallet and then realized that he had seen their faces and would be able to point them out to the police, after which her poor Edward had suffered injuries incompatible with life. "Did you capture them?" was all she asked, trying to disengage herself from the detailed description of her husband's injuries. "Not yet," sighed the policeman, "but the investigation is ongoing. I promise you, we will find whoever did this." "Well, find them." Indifferently, the woman thought, but said nothing out loud, realizing how wild it would sound in this situation. Right now, she didn't really care whether the bastards were captured or not. It wouldn't bring her husband back. And she didn't even think about the fact that they might be a danger to someone else. However, as it turned out, this was not the worst ordeal that cruel fate had prepared for her. At least, not the last. She was wrong. Edward's relatives didn't give a damn about her. They all as one hated her fiercely, but before the tragedy, they had smiled hypocritically in her face and cooed at her children. Now they were finally showing their true natures. They told her everything they thought. Over the next week, she found out that they thought she had married Edward solely because he was rich and successful, that she had tied him down with her belly and then kept having children to hold on to. When she realized that Mary would soon grow up and that leverage would be lost to her. Of course, they all thought she was no match for Edward. She was from an extremely poor family and an orphan. The only reason she didn't end up in an orphanage was because her maternal grandmother had agreed to take her in. But she was so strict and so driven, the poor girl, that she sometimes thought that she would be better off in an orphanage. For all these revelations could hardly hurt Emma now. The woman was trying to get over her grief. After all, no matter what anyone said, she truly loved her husband. Yes, in addition, she still had to take care of the children and think about how exactly she would now feed and clothe them. Emma married very early, barely 18 years old, and almost immediately afterwards became pregnant with Mary. Edward's salary was more than enough to provide for the whole family, so the woman had no motivation to get an education or look for a job. She saw herself in no other role than that of a caring mother and wife. The entire household was on her shoulders, and this suited both her and her husband. And what to do now she had no idea. Even if she is taken somewhere, for example, a saleswoman, she will have to work literally 24 hours a day, without days off, just to provide her family with everything they need. And who at this time will watch the children, especially the twins? In the summer, Mary could still take care of them, though she wouldn't like it. But then what? However, there was still the inheritance. It would be possible to sell the house and buy a more modest dwelling, maybe even a small apartment in a high-rise. Ideally, in this case, there would still be some money for the first time. And Edward's personal account would probably have some money saved up, which would now go to her. And by the time the savings came to an end, she could probably come up with something. But those plans were not destined to materialize. It turned out that the house they were living in was registered to Edward's parents, so they could forget about selling it. Moreover, Emma's ultimatum demanded that she immediately vacate the premises to which she had no rights, and take your Mary, you've already ruined her. And the little asshole, too, perhaps, and the younger ones will stay with us. We will bring them up ourselves, after all, our grandchildren, Edward's own blood. Her mother-in-law told her. No way, Emma said fiercely. You will not have my children. So where will you go with them? You're going to the garbage dump. That's where you belong, but spare the children. It's none of your business where I go. Emma cut me off. Well, as you know anyway, very soon the guardianship service will take them away from you, and then they will definitely come to us. Threatened her mother-in-law. That's when Emma remembered about her grandmother's old house, or rather her own, because the old lady, despite her bad temper and strained relations with her granddaughter, still left her everything she had as an inheritance. A small plot of land, and at that time not too strong house. It was located in a remote village, which was not easy to reach without a car. Obviously not the best option to move there with children, but Emma had no other options, and this was at least a roof over her head. Mary, of course, would have to be moved to the village school. She couldn't go to the city every day. She won't like it, but she's old enough to understand the necessity of such a step. What? Mary's up in arms. An old wreck in the middle of nowhere and a country school? Are you crazy or what? Don't be rude to your mother, replied Emma, more tired than angry. Or do you prefer the option of sleeping at the station? Just say the word and we'll be right back. No way, Mary snorted. Look, darling, we'll try to think of something. I hope it's just a temporary measure. You've only got 5 months left till the end of the year, and it'll be winter vacation soon, and we'll see what can happen in the meantime. Maybe we can sell the house. All right, the daughter softened. I'll survive somehow. They rode in the train, loaded with suitcases, strollers, and children. Mary held the older one's hands tightly, keeping them from scattering and getting into trouble. Emma had the twins in her arms, sleeping without a care in spite of their less than comfortable position. They were the only ones of the group unaware of the difficult situation they were in, so there was nothing to worry about. The train took about 2 hours to get to the station, and then the family had to take a bus, which, according to the schedule, ran every half hour till late afternoon. Emma remembered very well that in her childhood it was impossible to believe this schedule, but at least at this stage of the journey they were lucky. The old, cramped, gasoline-guzzling bus pulled up to the stop the minute the family and all their luggage reached it. For another 40 minutes they jolted along a bad country road, bouncing on endless bumps, falling into holes, but the most difficult part of the journey was undoubtedly the last one. It was impossible to do it otherwise than on foot, only by private car. No public transportation went directly to the village. They had to walk first along the same country road, and then turn into the forest, then get out into a large field, and then the village they were looking for began very near. All this difficult road took no more than an hour, provided, of course, that the weather was good, and the person walking on it was an adult and physically strong, and moreover light. They had to wade through the snowy debris, and besides, a snowstorm was about to start. And all this with heavy luggage and small children in their arms. But there was nothing to do. They had to go. As long as the path led them along the road, it was still bearable. In the forest, however, in spite of the fact that the path was very wide, it became quite difficult. At this time of year, there were seldom cars, much less pedestrians. Consequently, the whole road was covered with loose snow. Suddenly, when the woman was desperate to break through the snow, she heard the roar of an engine from behind. Turning around, she saw a huge SUV driving slowly but surely along the path. Such a car was not afraid of any obstacles, but despite this, the driver drove quietly and cautiously. But at least there will be a road in the morning, thought Emma, hurriedly pulling aside the children and suitcases. However, and to her surprise, the car slowed down next to them. The driver's side window rolled down and a man about her age or a little older stared at them. His eyes were filled with shock and confusion. "Where are you going in this weather?" he asked. "To the village." Emma replied, "I understand your surprise, but we have very good reasons to go there right now. It's a long story." "I'm sure there are." The man chuckled. "Hop in the car. I think you'll fit, though it'll be a little cramped. I'm on my way to the same place." Emma could not have imagined such a fortunate turn of events. No matter how many times she had walked along this road, no matter how many cars had passed her, she had never had anyone offer her a ride. Somehow, when she saw the car, she hadn't even thought of it as an option. Emma stowed 2 suitcases and 2 strollers in the roomy trunk, and with the middle children and Ethan, settled into the back seat. Mary, on the other hand, carefully took Cindy in her arms and sat next to the driver. When he was sure that everyone was in the car, he stepped on the gas, and the car continued to slowly make its way through the snow. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked. "It's late. My mother lives in this village," the man explained with some annoyance in his voice. "How many times I offered her to move to the city, but she wouldn't go for it. She'd gotten used to her home for many years. It would be hard for her. Then I suggested that she move to a more decent village, to this one. God forbid that even an ambulance will take 2 hours to get there. No, she doesn't want to. She says she was born here and will die here." The driver sighed heavily. "So I go to her when I finish work not too late." "Yeah, but it's less often than I'd like. I'm worried about her terribly. She's a perky girl, but she's still old." "I understand." Emma said, "Well, now it's your turn. It's a long way in the snow. Tell us your long story. We'll consider it a toll." Through the front mirrors, Emma saw him smiling broadly and couldn't help smiling back, then told him everything from the time her husband didn't come home one night to the last ugly fight with Edward's kin. She wasn't even allowed to take most of the children's things, and some things, like the twins' cradle, she wouldn't have been able to drag away with her anyway. Her husband's monetary inheritance, which was her only hope, as it turned out, was to be divided among all his numerous relatives according to his will. Of course, and Emma and the children printed a share, but it was a very modest amount, on which they could hardly last even a month. So I was left with only my grandmother's old house. Sadly, she summarized, that's where we're headed, and what to do next. Frankly speaking, I have no idea. Do you happen to know if there are any jobs in the village? Maybe a cleaner at the school or something like that." The driver thought hard, then said, I have an idea. Maybe you'll agree to look after my mom, help her around the house and all that. I won't be stingy on payment. It's really important to me." "I'd love to," Emma said. At that moment, they were just approaching the outskirts of the village, and when they asked which plot of land to drop them off at, and heard the answer, the man suddenly laughed out loud and then explained, "You will go to the neighboring house for work." Emma was afraid to believe that everything was going so well. However, when they drove up to her grandmother's old house, the good mood that had begun to appear fell below the plinth again. Unpleasant memories piled a heavy stone on her heart, and the sight of the plot did not inspire optimism. The woman, of course, realized that it would look very unkept. After all, no one had come here for many years. However, she hadn't expected this level of neglect at all. The area looked more like a piece of forest that had recently been hit by a hurricane than anything else. A huge fallen tree crisscrossed the entire lot, densely overgrown with weeds, dry stalks visible even from under a meter of snow. But the house was even worse. The old logs were cracked, the window frames were coming off the walls, the glass was broken in several places, and the building itself seemed to be swaying. Maybe it had always been like this, but she'd forgotten about it. She didn't even rule out the possibility that the roof might be cracked, though, of course, she couldn't see it from the street. "Thank you." She thanked the driver dejectedly. "By the way, what's your name?" "Edward," he introduced himself. Such coincidences happen, Emma thought in surprise, but she only said her name aloud. "Well, you're settling in." His words sounded like mockery, though it was clear that he hadn't planned it at all. "And I'll come back tomorrow, and we'll discuss the terms of your work." They said goodbye. With difficulty overcoming various obstacles, Emma and Mary dragged into the house, first the younger children and then the luggage. It was good that the suitcases were heavy but light. The strollers were much heavier. Opening the front door with her old key, Emma looked around warily. The place looked almost exactly as she remembered it. The same bookcases and the same small kitchen connected by a living space, the same dilapidated staircase leading to the second floor. Just from years of neglect, the house was covered in dust and cobwebs, and yes, snow piled up from the broken windows. Leaving the children downstairs, the woman climbed up to the second floor. Despite its appearance, the stairs were quite sturdy. It was much warmer upstairs and completely free of snow. Emma exhaled a sigh of relief. So the roof was fine. Well, it wasn't a resort, but she had expected the worst. The furniture on the second floor included her old crib and another bookcase, and there was a folded crib in the corner. She made sure that its mechanism, though a little rusty, was in good working order, so it could well be used as a bed. In addition to clothes and some of the children's things, Emma had managed to take with her a set of linens, which she now used to make the bed. Designed for a giant double bed, it was too big, but the woman thought it was no big deal. If it had been the opposite, too small, it would have been much worse. Emma put the children upstairs for the night. Mary and Kayla took the cot. James got the crib. The twins only had to be put in the stroller, one for two, because they refused to fall asleep separately. The woman herself stayed downstairs. Unlike everyone else, she couldn't afford to fall asleep. She had too much to do. The first thing Emma did was to heat the stove, and an hour later it warmed the small house all over, and it was quite possible to be inside without outer clothing, at least on the second floor. The snow that had piled up immediately began to melt. The woman did her best to sweep it out the door and then wipe up the remaining wet spots with an old rag. Then she tackled the windows. Luckily, there were plenty of unwanted rags and some dry cardboard boxes in the house. It allowed her to make temporary inserts to replace the broken windows and to plug all the cracks properly. Not too reliable, but there were no other options now anyway. Emma spent the rest of the night cleaning, scrubbing the floors, dusting, removing cobwebs. Occasionally, she went up to see if the children were all right. By morning, the house looked lively, though not very cozy, and the woman was so exhausted that she didn't notice how she fell asleep in the old chair by the stove. Mary woke her up when she came down to the first floor, rattling something and grumbling noisily to herself. Emma opened her eyes and was surprised to realize that her daughter was trying to cook porridge on the stove and heat feeding bottles for the twins at the same time. Of course, she wasn't used to it, but she was not very good at it. "Oops," she said, turning around. "Sorry, Mom didn't want to wake you up. I thought I'd make breakfast myself." "You didn't wake me up." Emma lied with a slight smile. "Thanks for your help, but let me show you how to do it." They were so engrossed in the cooking process that they didn't immediately notice the insistent knock at the door. It was Edward, as promised, coming to discuss the terms of employment. The woman with him was elderly, but quite vigorous. "Meet Clara, my mother," he said. "And this is Emma. I figured as much." The younger woman smiled. "Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you," the old woman replied. However, neither her gaze nor her voice expressed the slightest bit of warmth. Either she didn't trust Emma, which was understandable, or maybe she just wasn't thrilled with her son's idea of hiring her a nanny. It was immediately clear that it would not be easy to find a common language with her ward, and so their life in the countryside went on. Mary was also getting used to the new school. Emma, in her spare time, tried to put her grandmother's old house in some kind of order, and Edward helped her. Without listening to any objections, he hired a team of workers who put in the broken glass, properly caulked the cracks, and carried out a light cosmetic repair of the room. "Look, it's no problem for me," he said. "I just can't stand to see kids living in such horrible conditions." "Thank you," Emma answered him, embarrassed. "Don't be grateful, and don't think you owe me anything, nothing like that." Clara had been really hard to deal with at first, nagging Emma and rejecting any help she offered. Even if it was really difficult to cope with the case, which she took up on her own, the mother of many children, such behavior slightly pissed her off. What a mean old woman! Does not realize that this is her job. And she does not pester her willingly. It's her duty, or maybe she really doesn't understand. Emma thought about it. She had a feeling that there was some strange reticence between them that prevented them from building normal communication. And so, once again, when the old woman almost forcefully rushed to take away her broom, the woman could not stand it. "Clara, what are you really doing? It's really hard for you to bend over. Why not let someone help you? Especially since your son pays me good money for it. You're making me feel very uncomfortable. How would I feel if I had a babysitter? No one thought of that. I'm not a frail old woman, and I'm not completely out of my mind to be under 24-hour surveillance. Not round the clock," Emma corrected her curtly. "Don't you realize Edward is worried about you? No one thinks you can't handle things on your own. He just wants to make things easier for you, and I think he thinks you're just plain bored here alone. Then he should come more often." Clara muttered, not as confidently as before. "I'm sure he comes as often as he can." "I see." Clara sighed, sinking tiredly into the chair. "I'm sorry, Emma. I shouldn't have thrown myself at you. I realize with my mind that you and my son only wish me well, but I can't help it. I keep thinking that I'm being mistaken for some kind of a woman." The old woman didn't finish. Emma knew exactly what she meant. And then a wonderful idea came into her head, an idea to reconcile her grandmother with the help she was giving her and to relieve her loneliness. Somehow she was sure Edward wouldn't object to such a thing. "Listen, Clara," she began softly. "Do you like children? Who doesn't?" The old woman replied, "Then I can offer you this variant of our further interaction. I will come to you and do all the housework, as a matter of fact, and should. You will contact me if you have even the slightest difficulty. But I will also bring my children to you and ask you to watch them. How does that sound?" Clara first looked at Emma with a puzzled look and then smiled broadly. It was clear that this option completely suited the old woman. After all, it seemed that they were helping each other in a completely reciprocal way, and she would no longer feel completely old and infirm. The proposed scheme worked perfectly. Clara treated Emma's children as if they were her own grandchildren, which she never had, but apparently wanted very much. Kayla and James, under her watchful eye, suddenly stopped their pranks and became about as sweet and obedient children as they had been before. Even the twins, who were not particularly fond of strangers, behaved quite calmly in her presence, letting her feed and change their clothes. The old woman had a real talent for parenting. "How I missed it," she said dreamily one day. "It's been so many years since I've been close to children." "You mean Edward's childhood?" Emma inquired. "Not only that. I used to work in a school as an elementary school teacher." "Why did you leave? Did it get hard?" Emma asked worriedly. "It wasn't hard." The old woman waved the question away. "I was kicked out. The director changed and immediately began, so to speak, to reshuffle the staff. He said that the elderly should rest, and the school should be taught by the young and active. Suspecting that my place was very necessary to his young and active mistress. That's quite a story." "I sympathize." "Oh well, at least now I can babysit yours. James has an amazing aptitude for math. He should be in a special class. Only here in the village, though, there aren't any." So slowly Emma and her children settled in the village. Mary, at first shunned by the local children, in the spring was already in full swing with her new friends. James and Kayla, apparently, began to consider Clara their own grandmother, and she did not object. Soon it was time to do the planting. Emma simply caught fire with the idea of organizing a real vegetable garden on her plot. The village men gladly helped their new neighbor in clearing the plot. "It's been bothering us for a long time," one of them explained when they came to offer their help. "All over the village everything is clean and beautiful, and only here it is desolate. So, mistress, we are very glad that you came and decided to take care of the plot." The most difficult, as expected, was a huge tree that had fallen across the territory. The men, of course, led in a chainsaw and removed it piece by piece. But there was still a root adjacent to the house. Everyone was afraid that some outgrowths would not go further to the foundation. Then the removal of this part could lead to some unpleasant destruction. Eventually, after conferring, Emma's volunteer helpers came to some sort of solution. She didn't have much of a view of what exactly they were doing there, as she was busy destroying the weeds at the other end of the plot. She was distracted from this fascinating endeavor by a loud, annoyed shout from the entrance to the house. Running over, the woman found that the root had been pulled out. It hadn't caused much damage, but the porch was clearly beyond repair. With mild irritation, Emma thought she would have to make a new one. At the same moment, however, she was glad that this unfortunate incident was the only one. And then she noticed among the wooden debris some suspicious gleam. The woman bent down and looked closely and saw a small key. At first, she thought it had been dropped by one of the workers, but no one could identify her find. And she soon realized that the key, old and dirty with soil, had probably been lying under the porch for years. Without realizing why, she slipped it into her jeans pocket and quickly forgot about the incident. Her thoughts were occupied with something else entirely. After all, she had not only her own vegetable garden on her shoulders, but also the neighbors', which of course looked much more decent, but still required quite a decent amount of work. Spring flew by without anyone noticing, and June came. Mary was very proud of herself. She managed to finish the 10th grade with straight A's. Emma had a new concern. She had to get James to school, who was to start studying in the 1st grade in September. Everything would be all right, but Clara insisted that his math talents should not be buried in the ground. She didn't like the idea of such a gifted boy going to an ordinary rural school. She suggested a boarding school for gifted children as an alternative. "Oh my God!" Emma exclaimed every time she made that suggestion. He wouldn't even be 7 in September, so how could he be alone, surrounded by strangers? But he'll come for vacations, and weekends too. I'm sure we can arrange for my son to bring him here, and then take him to school. Still, 5 days a week in a completely unfamiliar environment with strangers, he'll think we've abandoned him, that no one wants him here. Nonsense. That's what Clara said. All the children there are about the same age, and almost no one has any problems, especially not such an independent boy as James. But he will miss his sister, and Kayla will miss him too. And how is it so fundamentally different from going to a regular school? He'll have classes there too, where no one will let her go. Kids have to get used to not being together all the time. After all, Emma, you seem to forget that I'm a professional teacher and understand something about child psychology. Emma knew that there was a lot of truth in what she said, and yet she was incredibly scared to send her child away so early, even though she knew very well that this boarding school was one of the best schools in the city, and she could imagine the difficulties many people had to go through to get their children there. She had a unique chance to send James to school without making any effort at all. Clara, who still had some connections, had already arranged for him to be accepted if he passed the entrance exam. However, not only she, but even Emma herself, had no doubts about that. The exams were in August, so they had 2 months to think it over. So each time, Emma avoided the discussion under a plausible pretext, hoping that somehow, magically, a compromise solution would be found that would suit everyone. This problem, however, was firmly planted in her mind. Sometimes she would toss and turn in bed for long periods of time, unable to sleep. On such nights, Emma's thoughts wandered in circles, but never led her to a decision. And that's exactly what happened on that fateful day, which once again changed her family's life dramatically. When the woman was lying in bed, suffering from insomnia, she suddenly thought she heard a strange sound, like the crackling of fire. At first, she paid no attention to it, thinking it must be the stove. Despite the onset of summer, the nights were still chilly, and it wasn't too comfortable to sleep in the house without her. Emma was even almost able to fall asleep, lulled to sleep by these sounds that seemed quite pleasant, but after a minute she jumped up abruptly on the bed. For some time she sat in some strange tension, herself, not really understanding what was causing it. Then at last it came to her. The sound of the burning fire was clearly not coming from the stove. She had long ago gotten used to that slight crackling sound and had accepted it simply as background noise. So why should she pay attention to it all of a sudden? No, there was clearly something wrong here. Emma listened and realized the sound was coming from the wrong side of the stove. What's more, it was much louder and growing louder by the minute. There was some kind of clattering and whistling mixed in with the fiery interval. Jumping up from the bed, Emma looked around the room. It was quiet, no sign of fire. She went up to the second floor to the children, all of whom were sleeping peacefully, not noticing anything unusual. Nothing was obviously burning here either. And then Emma's gaze fell on the window. For the first moment she froze, startled, then she snapped out of her seat and rushed downstairs, pulling on her jacket and grabbing her phone from the table. In the yard, she dashed to the well and grabbed a bucket of water. So, with the heavy bucket in one hand and the other dialing the fire department's number on the phone, she rushed to the Clara house, which was burning as if it were made of dry straw. As soon as she was answered, the woman mouthed the address into the receiver and disconnected. Tucking the phone into her jacket pocket, she began pouring water on the burning house, then rushed to the well and as quickly as she could, drew another bucket. But where was it? The fire was already burning too much to be extinguished in that way. Emma tried to get through the fire to get inside the house, but she could not do so. The flames were burning intolerably and were everywhere. The windows and doors were jammed, and she could not open them. But she could see through the glass that the fire was already inside. She did not understand why Clara herself did not take any steps to save herself, did not scream, did not try to get out of the house. Maybe she wasn't there at all. A comforting thought flashed through her mind. Had she stayed the night at one of her girlfriend's houses or something? Soon other neighbors began to appear near the house, who also noticed something wrong. Someone's strong hands pulled Emma away from the door, which she was still trying to open, not realizing that her jacket was on fire. Men ran around the building, some with buckets and some with fire extinguishers, but all their efforts were in vain. The fire seemed to be getting even hotter, and now they were extinguishing not even the house itself, but the space around it. It was clear to everyone that they would not be able to save the building on their own. Emma, exhausted, sat on the ground. She didn't even feel the pain from the burns she had received, and there was only one thought in her head: if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home, if only she were not at home. "Look out!" someone shouted, and that's when the fire department arrived. I wish she wasn't inside. That was Emma's last thought before she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt that she was lying on something soft, something pleasantly cold on her forehead. She reached out and gently touched the object. Apparently, someone had placed a compress of cool water-soaked cloth on her head. Trying not to throw it off, the woman looked around and realized she was in her own home. "Thank God you're awake." She heard a familiar voice. Turning at the sound, she saw Edward sitting beside her bed. His face expressed decidedly nothing, but the woman noticed how red and swollen his eyes were. It looked like the man had been crying. She turned cold. A burned-down house was certainly very unpleasant, but hardly the kind of incident that could bring a grown man to tears. "Clara?" I asked, afraid to hear the answer. Edward made a strange sound, as if sobbing, but immediately pulled himself together. "Dead." In a husky voice, he said. "Firemen dug up the body. Looks like she was asleep when it happened. Her now. Anyway, she's being examined by a pathologist, but the firemen are sure she didn't at least. Anyway, she didn't die from the fire. She suffocated. It's less agonizing after all." She felt tears running down her cheeks. In the short time they'd known each other, she'd grown to love that perky old woman. Not to mention how upset the children, who considered her almost their own grandmother, would be. "How are you feeling?" Edward asked. "Me?" She didn't understand. "Yeah, well, you were hurt too. Bad burns, heat stroke." That's what the paramedics said. They even wanted to take you to the hospital. But I thought if you woke up there, you'd go crazy worrying about the kids. The neighbors say you tried to break down the doors and break in despite the fire. And the fire department says that if you had succeeded, they would have found 2 bodies instead of 1. And the children? She didn't feel the pain of the burns, though she supposed she should have, but it was hard to speak. The phrases came out short, and her voice sounded strangely stilted somehow, as if she'd blown it off. Perhaps she had, though the woman didn't remember yelling anything. Upstairs, Mary was now trying to get the younger ones back into bed. They all woke up when they heard you screaming and, of course, freaked out when they realized what was happening. My screams! You don't remember? You were not only breaking into the house, you were screaming for help. In fact, it wasn't even the fire that woke up a lot of the neighbors. It was you. Too late. Emma muttered bitterly. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. Edward said harshly, the only one to blame here is the one who set the fire. Arson? His eyes widened. That's the main theory so far. There's nothing else that could have caused the house to go up in flames. Our heating was all electric, and Mom wasn't in the habit of leaving the stove on. And the fire department says that the fire, from what they saw, was not a typical domestic blaze. Yeah, well, that's a police matter. You don't have to worry about that. Emma felt herself falling back into sleep. She wanted to ask something else, but her tongue wouldn't move and her eyelids were slipping. After a few minutes, the woman realized that she was unable to fight it any longer and lost consciousness again. 3 days later, Emma fully recovered. Of course, the burns still reminded of themselves, but otherwise everything was fine, except for the extremely depressed state. On the 3rd day, she and her children were going to the funeral, but the woman found it hard to concentrate on anything, and everything she did fell out of her hands. The children, extremely saddened by Slav's death, were once again behaving disgustingly. Even the twins, who were too young to realize what had happened, cried incessantly. And just as they were about to leave, Ethan pooped his pants. Mary, change his diaper, please. Helplessly, Emma asked, Why do I have to clean up after him? Mary asked in a deliberately squeaky voice, her lips pressed together. You don't have to, honey. I just asked you to help because I can't do it myself. You shouldn't have had so many kids if you couldn't handle it, Mary muttered. But Emma ignored the jab, and the girl sighed heavily and got down to business. Finally, everything was ready, and the family left the house. Edward was waiting for them at the gate in his car. He said that he would drive them to the funeral, not wanting to hear any objections. Emma, however, was too powerless to argue seriously with him on the subject. As soon as they arrived at the cemetery, Emma and Mary got out of the car, and a man in a policeman's uniform, who until that moment had been standing quietly near the fence, came toward them. As he approached, he showed the woman his ID and sternly inquired, Are you Wilson, Emma? Yeah. Confused, Emma confirmed. Emma, you're under arrest on suspicion of willful arson, damage to property, and death. What? Edward and Mary exclaimed indignantly. You must come with me to the police station immediately. Without paying attention to them, the policeman continued, This is some kind of stupid misunderstanding. Edward continued to argue with him. Man, if you continue to interfere with the work of the police, I will arrest you too. The policeman threatened him. Edward, don't. Emma suddenly spoke up. Please look after my children. Of course he promised. For some reason, Emma thought the policeman would lead her to some nearby station on foot. Instead, he put her in the back seat of the police car, not forgetting to handcuff her. They drove for at least 40 minutes, as far as the woman could tell, to the other side of town. At the police station, she was locked in a cage. It was hard to call this room differently. Wherever you looked from all sides, she was surrounded by bars. The size of the room was about 2 by 2 meters, and all of its furniture consisted of a rickety and hard stool to sit down on which she did not dare to sit. She did not know how long it was before a scowling policeman, not the one who had brought her here, but some other one, opened the door of her cell and led her down some long, gloomy corridors to an interrogation room. There was a table where another man sat, a chair across from it, on which Emma's escort sat, pushing her roughly before removing himself. "Emma Wilson?" clarified the investigator. She nodded. He made a notation in his notebook. "Emma, you are being questioned in a case of willful injury to life, with aggravating circumstances. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to a phone call as well as the protection of an attorney. If for some reason you do not want to hire one, you will be provided with a public defender. I must also warn you that our conversation is being recorded. Is that clear to you?" Emma nodded again. "Well, good, then let's get started. Tell me what you did on the night of June 3rd through June 4th. She tried to describe the events of that terrible night in as much detail as possible. How she couldn't sleep, how she heard a suspicious noise and couldn't figure out what it was for a long time, how she finally realized that something was burning somewhere. She rushed to check the children's room and saw the fire in the window as she called the firemen and ran to Clara's house. But what happened next, she couldn't even remember. She must have been too shocked. The investigator, however, was not satisfied. He asked her endless questions, trying to get all the information he could out of her. She honestly tried to answer them, but she realized how unconvincing her words sounded. "Well, okay." The investigator stretched out, abruptly changing the topic of conversation. "As I understand, you and the deceased were close. Yes, you could say that." Emma replied. "Explain," he demanded. She went on again, recounting the circumstances of their acquaintance, the contract she had made with Edward. Then she tried to explain how it had come about that Clara had taken care of her children and had practically replaced their grandmother. "You cooked at her house, didn't you?" The investigator asked, as if again out of turn. "Did you have access to food?" "Well, yes," Emma said. "Could anyone other than you and your children have had access to the food in Clara's house?" "Edward probably. He brought groceries to his mother. Maybe someone else. She often had visitors, but I can't say for sure." The investigator looked at her, studying her, and then sighed heavily. "You see, here's the thing. Most likely she couldn't get out of the fire because she was sleeping very soundly and just didn't know what was going on. Forensics found a large dose of sleeping pills in her bloodstream. And you think," Emma said with horror in her voice, "that I slipped it into her system? Alas, we see no other options. We could, of course, thank Edward, but he has an airtight alibi. And don't look at me with such judgment. He's her son. That doesn't mean anything. Did you know that most often the perpetrator is someone close to the deceased?" Emma shook her head, then said, "Look, why would I hurt her? She was babysitting my kids, and I was getting the money I needed. Being her nurse and housekeeper all in one. Yeah, it's really messed up, but personally, I don't think you thought she was gonna die. Not everyone on this case agrees with me, but I still don't think you'd do arson. You probably slipped the old lady sleeping pills for some more innocuous purpose, maybe not even criminal, but you overdosed her. And you picked a very bad day to do it. That's what your behavior at the fire suggests to me. Witnesses say you almost burned yourself trying to get into a burning house. But why? Was it because you knew that Clara was asleep inside and couldn't get out on her own? Tell me the truth, Emma. I promise it will count for something in court." Emma exhaled sharply. Now she understood what the investigator wanted. He's being a good cop, pretending to be on her side, wanting her to confess that she did slip sleeping pills, and if she does, he'll go on to find out if she could have set the house on fire too. Purely by accident, of course. "I want a lawyer," she said sharply. "Well, that's your right." The investigator sounded disappointed. The lawyer for Emma was hired by Edward, who had all sorts of connections for every occasion. He had managed to get the woman released on her own recognizance, based on physical evidence and witness testimony. She was still a suspect, but the police had no evidence against her, only speculation. Emma hated to go back to the village. Yes, in the few months she had spent there, she had grown to love the place. But now it was soaked with the memories of the terrible incident. The woman, however, was not so much worried for herself as for the children. It is unlikely that now they will be cozy and quiet in their old home. "Why don't you stay with me for a while?" Edward suddenly suggested it. No, it would be awkward. Emma hesitated. "It's not inconvenient at all. I live in a rather spacious apartment where I appear only once every 3 days. You won't make me uncomfortable there." After some thought, Emma agreed to his proposal. It was only when she arrived at Edward's house that she realized that he was obviously being modest. His rather spacious apartment had 2 floors and a dozen rooms. Each floor had its own front door, so that the inhabitants of the first and second tier could never meet. "It used to be 2 separate apartments," Edward explained. "But I'd always wanted a 2-story wonder like this, so I bought both and remodeled them. I've been thinking about getting my mom in here." Emma and the kids are comfortable on the 2nd floor. However, no one forbade them to go down to the 1st floor, but for some reason everyone was shy. Even though Edward hadn't lied, he was rarely at home, either working or doing something else. Periodically, her lawyer visited her to update her on the progress of the investigation. However, he had no particular news on the matter. The investigation still had no solid evidence against the main suspect, no new versions. The police were treading water. But one day, the lawyer appeared on the doorstep of Edward's apartment in a highly agitated state, and Emma immediately realized that the case had finally moved on. "They searched the crime scene again," the lawyer said. "For the 5th time, I think. But now they found something new?" Emma guessed. Before they were only looking upstairs, but now they decided to check the foundation. And apparently, they found the source of the fire. They did. Exactly. There's a whole secret room deep in the house on the basement level. Apparently, that's what they tried to burn, doused it with gasoline and set it on fire. The fire then spread to the house. The police even suspect that the criminals didn't plan it. They just weren't too smart. But it was a waste. The room is practically the only thing that survived. There is a very strong metal door, and the whole room, apparently, made of heat-resistant materials. Apparently? Emma raised an eyebrow. "Well, it's not clear yet. We couldn't get into the room. The door is very strong, and the lock is very complicated. We could, of course, use more drastic measures, but the police are afraid that they might damage some important evidence. There's no need for such measures." Emma said abruptly. The lawyer looked at her with bewilderment, and without explaining anything, she rushed to her room and dug among the hangings of the old jeans she had once worn in the vegetable garden. Frantically rummaging through all the pockets, and she exhaled with relief. Somehow, the item she was looking for hadn't gotten lost among the things. "Let him try this key first," she said, holding it out to the lawyer. "Not a sure thing, of course, but I don't rule out that it might fit." The lawyer continued to look at her, not understanding, even with some suspicion. Emma sighed and told him about how the workmen had broken the porch of her house trying to pull a malignant blighted tree root out of the ground, and how an old key was found in the wreckage of the porch. "I thought at the time that it was from some old chest or something," she explained, "and that my grandmother had lost it, and the chest had been opened and thrown away, or the lock had been changed. Maybe that's true, but I think that Clara might have given it to her for safekeeping, and she hid it under the porch, or even, who knows, maybe Clara herself hid it secretly. Such an option cannot be excluded," thoughtfully said the lawyer. "It sounds quite logical, especially since the room is obviously stored something that was not intended for other people's eyes. Thank you, I'll pass it on to the police. Keep me informed." Emma asked. "I will." With a slight smile, the man replied and disappeared. A week passed, followed by another, and the lawyer didn't even call. Emma was a little worried, but for some reason she didn't dare to call him herself. After all, he's a busy man. If he doesn't show up, he probably doesn't have any news on the case. Or if he did, but he had no right to talk about it. Besides, her mind was increasingly occupied with other things, like the fact that little Kayla had suddenly started calling Edward Daddy. Unlike her older brother and sister, she hardly remembered her real father, so it wasn't too surprising. Much stranger was the fact that James soon adopted the habit from her sister, but Mary persisted in calling him Uncle Edward. The twins, because of their age, had so far remained completely neutral in the matter. None of them had yet uttered their first word, though both of them were already crawling and even trying to walk. Edward himself, however, did not object to such treatment. On the contrary, he seemed to like it. He spent quite a lot of time with the children. Every time he came home, he brought each of them a present, and he always guessed who would like what. She was even beginning to catch herself feeling a different kind of sympathy for Edward than she had before. More and more often it occurred to her that he might actually make a good father for her children. She was afraid of that feeling, however, and tried hard not to let it fester. After all, she had lost her husband only a year ago. Was it decent to look at another man after such a short time?